Good evening, everyone. It is Tuesday, 7:40 p.m. You are joining us again here on Pump Up the Volume, where we're amplifying the voices of communities and really bringing stories that you don't normally hear on mainstream media. And of course, presenting questions that challenge the status quo, challenge the narratives that mainstream media often pushes forward for an administration that we know at this time during the pandemic has time and time again provided misinformation and really directed us away from the facts. And we're starting to see that now. And so, if it's up to me, I just want to take off and go right into it. But as always, we're going to go ahead and introduce my co-host here, and we're going to talk a little bit about who we are and what our intention is. And then we're going to start with an update regarding news that has, come up in Rhode Island over the past 7 days. My name is Luis Daniel Munoz. I'm a medical doctor, also previously an independent gubernatorial candidate here in the state of Rhode Island. And from 2018, when I ran to on, much of the predictions around needing healthcare infrastructure in the state of Rhode Island have really, come to the realization of many other Rhode Islanders. And it's tough to have to acknowledge that given the current crises, but it's also important to acknowledge it so that we all know that in moving forward, something needs to change. I'm also joined by Mr. Bill Bartholomew from the Bartholomew Town podcast, also with his own show on PBS now. So keep a lookout for Bill. Bill's also constantly on the ground, whether it's protest, whether it's social unrest, whether it is this pandemic, always bringing us the latest news and really presenting some of the most challenging questions in the press conferences to this administration. So it's great to have Bill with us. We also have Mr. Scott Rotunda from WBOB 990. And again, Scott has been in his own way, not only an independent media person, but also an advocate and an activist, I would say, especially in the city of Pawtucket, oftentimes bringing voices to forums where political candidates are presenting their ideas and also helping facilitate some of those discussions. So making a huge impact on a daily basis. So it's great to have Scott with us as well. And we have Mr. Pat Ford, founder of the Rhode Island Libertarian Party. He does not let anyone forget that, and also founder of the Coalition Radio Network.
I'm one of the founders of the Libertarian Party. There was about a half a dozen of us, and we all work together as a team. Okay, now my ego goes unhinged on the coalition. Okay.
Well, it's good to have us all on board, and I oftentimes don't go one by one introducing us, but I realize that we may have listeners that are tuning in for the first time. So I think it's important to know who who's speaking and what our backgrounds are, because we're taking those backgrounds and we're coming with that level of passion. And also, we're pretty much trying to bring you the facts, right? We're not trying to serve as any of these podcasters out there that are just trying to get ratings. We're trying to really bring you the true story of what's going on in the state of Rhode Island, how you can protect yourself, inform yourself, and of course, pump up the volume. So as always, we're going to start off with Bill. Bill's going to give us a rundown of what's happened over the past 7 days regarding news. And we'll take off from that update and really, go to where the emphasis is, which I think we all know where it is, but I'll let Bill tell us first.
Well, we don't have to spend too much time on this today because the news right now is pretty dark. And it's that Rhode Island has entered into a conversation as being one of the 4 top COVID hotspots in the world, joining Indiana and then the nations of Georgia and Serbia in terms of the 100 per 100,000 metric. And I think right now we're at a point where, there's an interesting thread that Dr. Megan Ranney put up on Twitter. And I just want to read the headline that I pulled out of that. I was monitoring something else in real time here. Here's Dr. Ranney of Rhode Island Hospital, Brown University. We're calling for retired healthcare workers to volunteer while allowing people to eat in person at Denny's. And that's exactly where we're at right now. That's why the mixed messaging that's happened from the administration over the last few weeks, going back to the announcement of the pause, in which you literally saw permission for Black Friday to take place, Twin River to stay open, at the same time that small businesses were facing, I talked to some restaurant owners that told me that at 33% indoor dining, there's really no point to even be open, that they'd be better off going to takeout only, so that compromise that the governor put forth was barely even of any value. But we find ourselves in this position now, thanks in part to colleges and universities being open, and largely thanks to just a loss of contact tracing and a complete meltdown in terms of an aggressive plan. And we'll see what happens on Thursday, but I'm hearing right now from some folks that be prepared for an extreme lockdown situation coming this week.
Yeah, thanks so much for the update, Bill. It's interesting you mentioned college students. The last Equity Council meeting that I attended, it was one of the questions I had as I said, well, if we're doing such great contact tracing and higher, uh, institutions of higher education are ultimately doing a good job, because that was one of the presentations that was delivered, what's the data like? Like, do we have the data to assess the impact? So when we have geographic clusters of college students living off campus that have been infected, can we trace their impact on the surrounding community? And you would think if contact tracing were of good quality, if Rhode Island Department of Health were actually doing the necessary tracking, that information would be available, right? Where they could say, this was the impact. And you would hope that they would say, this is the impact and it was this small. But not only did they not say that, but they essentially presented the idea that they hadn't even gone through the assessment. Now, I don't know how true that is, but it is concerning. And some of the information you shared, Bill, is the reason why it's concerning, right? We have institutions like Brown University included, right? PC. These institutions are not paying taxes. They are benefiting. They are gentrifying neighborhoods, right? So they're profiting in many cases, because as they take real estate, they actually build businesses internal to that. And those businesses at times can have certain protections around them as well. So you see this happening in real time. Then you have the pandemic. And then you have a pandemic that's having a real impact on lives, on the healthcare system. And you have this influx of students into the state of Rhode Island, live off campus, get infected because of certain behaviors, spread it in the communities, and then go back to their homes. And those institutions that aren't paying taxes really don't do anything after that, right? They just sit back and hope that the tracing doesn't get back to them. But we have to live with the results of the disconnect with the well-being of our communities and versus the well-being of these institutions. With well-being from the institutional perspective, I think the governor would agree, is purely economic, as with the governor's general response in this crisis being focused on the economic side of things. So that's me with a little bit of a vent, but just want to acknowledge that we continue to be in a place where the administration, even if it takes dramatic, extreme measures on Thursday, it is reactive. It has not been proactive. And if someone is being guided by science, then the evidence of that is that, in fact, the actions you take are proactive, right? The actions you're taking are to mitigate the spread. The actions that you're taking are to limit the potential clusters that might form. And over the past 3 weeks, we've seen the total opposite of that with this administration. And so moving forward, what I said in the spring, unfortunately, has come to realization, which is that we were seen as one of the states doing the best, right? Because our testing was being increased by a certain number. But I mentioned it in the spring, rapid test was not very sensitive. We were losing a lot of positive cases. They were coming back, quote unquote, negative, but they were actually positive. They were going back to communities. But from a numbers perspective with testing, it seemed well. And then this administration couldn't actually show that they actually had the back end capacity to keep up with testing. So they would have the rapid test, but for all the nasopharyngeal tests, the traditional tests, they didn't have the laboratory capabilities to get those results back within a reasonable time frame. People were waiting between 7 and 10 days at times, which is pretty much past the state of isolation, right? I mean, the people had pretty much infected who they were going to infect, and if they survived, they survived. So that was revealed in the spring. Since that time throughout the summer, there was an indication that testing could expand further, that laboratory capacity could expand further. But in all of that, what they failed to do simultaneously, to give you a timeline, is to create the resource coordination, the connection between social services, right, money, and people in isolation and quarantine, to actually ensure that everyone who had to be in isolation and quarantine would have all the resources they need and would not be leaving to the grocery store to get food while they were infected, right? So I'm focusing on a single narrative here. I'm not talking about public transportation, all the other issues that we've talked about in the show. But in this single narrative of testing to back-end diagnostic laboratory capacity to food and resource coordination, what that is telling us is that we're now in a point where our hospitals are at or beyond capacity, mirroring what's going on in Massachusetts. Our numbers are skyrocketing. Any extreme measure taken on Thursday will have very little impact in what we're going to see over the next 2 weeks, which is a worsening number of individuals that not only are infected, but also, when I say worsening, a higher number of individuals that are infected, but also a higher number of individuals that are ending up in the hospital, field hospitals, and possibly needing ventilator support. So there is the science, right? So what proactive measures did we take in that timeline? None. It was all reactive. And so for any reactive measures that we may take in the future, I just don't know what it could be at this point, with the exception of just pretty much triaging, crisis management, rationing of resources. So with that, happy to take this conversation to any other direction any of my co-hosts would like, but I want to throw it back out there and say that we are in a dark place, as Bill mentioned. What do we do in the next 3 days? What do we do in the next 7 days? Last time we focused on 4 months. Let's talk about the next week. Pat?
Well, of course, typically during the show, my focus has been on the economy and the impact on the business community, because without jobs, we're at a crisis point, and we're at let's just say we're approaching core meltdown here. I echo your frustrations, Doctor, but also the real tragedy is that while we've accomplished very little in actually stemming the re-onset of the disease, if you will, at the same time, we've wrecked our economy while doing it. I'm not sure how much worse things could have been if folks had just simply been able to use common sense, make their choices, and move forward. After this show tonight on the Coalition, I'm going to be interviewing a gentleman by the name of Matt D'Amico. He is one of the proprietaries of the health club that has gotten into a dust-up with the Socialist Workers' Paradise of Rhode Island. And the problem is that you're right. We're not using science. We're taking scattershot approaches. There's, as I pointed out to the governor, much to her amusement, the only business closed in the Lincoln Mall wasn't the food business, where people are handling food, and that's touched multiple hands, if you will. It wasn't a variety of training facilities where folks are in close contact. It was the gym, who, by all accounts, I've interviewed people who are members of that gym, is possibly one of the cleanest places in Rhode Island, and serves a medical and therapeutic purpose. We have all the worst results right now. We have a crushed economy, and we have really no cogent, coherent response to the disease other than enter another shutdown. And I don't know, and here's my challenge to the group, I don't know if business owners are going to sit for it. There is a spirit out there right now where people are just simply not willing to lose everything they've had and everything they've worked for over a generation for the latest, let's Rube Goldberg / let's wing it and let's try this and let's pray like hell it works. And that's a crisis. So, again, I echo your sentiments. We are in a dark, dark place. And I don't know. I don't see the cavalry, if you will, out in the distance on their way.
What do we do in 7 days, Scott?
So what do we do in 7 days? Honestly, we're talking about extreme measures, and Dr. Munoz, I hate to be alarmist here, but extreme measures for what at this point? Really, extreme measures for what? It's all been a failure. That the contact tracing has absolutely fallen apart. This partial reopening, partial shutdown of the economy has been an absolute farce. And as Pat has said, it's done a lot more harm than good. Honestly, I come away from this with the opinion that our governor was kind of the opinion that she would have been approved for one of those cabinet level jobs in Washington right now, and this would be someone else's problem. And frankly, doesn't know what to do at this point. I mean, she had her eyes on a bigger prize, and we're all paying the price for it. And as Pat alluded to, especially with the absolute death blow to small business that this is going to have, I mean, I just think we're going to feel the effect of this for generations. I wish I had some sort of silver lining that I could give to you guys, but I mean, well, like Pat has said, I mean, I don't even see the light at the end of the tunnel right now. I mean, the vaccine is coming out, and I heard, in England today, there's been people, getting the vaccine, and that's fantastic. Mazel tov. We'll finally put COVID-19 on the ash bin of history where it belongs. But how we recover from that, I just don't know. So in terms of what we do in the next 7 days, I mean, sure, you want to lock the whole state down, go ahead, lock the whole state down. It's about a month too late. I wish I had something else, more concrete to say, but that's just where I'm at right now. Extreme measures for what? You might as well at this point unlock everything.
I understand your frustration, Scott. I understand. And regarding the governor, I mean, we know that the governor is all about political optics, and frankly, she does that well.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think, given with the state of Rhode Island, it would have benefited her future career in politics had she left to HHS. So I'm not saying that it would have been the final decision even made by the president or president-elect, but I do think that it would have been a very interesting narrative, right? To leave a state that is currently doing worse than so many other states and just to abandon it. So it seemed strategic that she would turn it down.
Yeah, but it's the Peter principle. You get promoted to your level of incompetence, and that would have been exactly what would have happened.
It is interesting, right? We've seen this failure across states, across parties. Republican, Democrat governors just not having a clue how to handle it. And I think this goes back this goes back to something I said all along. We live in an era of technology and healthcare. Technology and healthcare and the intersection of those worlds is what the future is in every industry. And yet our politically elected officials are, for the most part, the majority really are not well versed in science and technology, right? Many of them are still continuing to come out the business sector or law. And I think hopefully, I would hope that after this crisis, things will start to change a bit. But with that, I don't want to take the conversation too far politically. I want to go back to Bill and say, Bill, what do we do in the next 7 days?
Close schools, in-person learning immediately terminated from now until at least mid-January. Most likely that would include a suspension of any learning whatsoever. You know what I mean? An extended vacation, sort of a European style approach. Teachers are exasperated. They're having a really difficult time translating this moment into something productive. Okay. That's something that I hear from Westerly to Woonsocket, okay, inside charter schools, inside urban core schools, that this is a moment there's no good answer. So the right thing to do may be to shut it down temporarily. Suspend all in-person dining. Close all businesses immediately. Pay people to stay at home. Pay businesses to get through. How do you do it? MMT, Modern Monetary Theory. There's a great book out, The Deficit Myth. We can really start to understand how we can print more and more money. The deficit is fraudulent, that our economy is a sham, essentially. And there's a way to get through this moment. And it's literally paying people to stay home. It's literally closing businesses. As far as the Max Gym guy, and people like that, to me, a lot of people praise them as being defiant and American. To me, they're an embarrassment. And if I had everything that I do right now, I'm thinking in terms of how can I protect my community? How can I protect the people around me? And suspending anything that is even somewhat risky is the correct thing to do in the next 7 days. I'm not saying for 40 or 50 months. I'm saying for the next 7 to 10 days. But the reality is right now we're playing catch up. And even with that sort of extreme approach, we may never be able to get back to where we need to be. And by the way, we may eradicate COVID-19, but what about COVID-21? What about COVID-22? Whether it's a coronavirus or a similar type of healthcare meltdown, are we even remotely prepared for that? We should be boots on the ground, figuring out right now how to do what we didn't do all spring and summer, which is something you talk about all the time, Dr. Munoz, brick and mortar testing, healthcare facilities all around the state that are either walking distance or have transportation. And we should be mobilizing that right now, and that's where we should be. If we go quote unquote broke in the process, that's fine, but we need to take steps forward, but to me, my message is to all the small businesses that are defiantly opening, how embarrassing, how un-American, and boy, do I hope that, you get raked through the coals.
Yeah, I hear what
See,
you're
I
saying.
I got to challenge you on that, though. I'm gonna be the loyal opposition here. The problem, Bill, is that when the smoke settles, and I get we've got circumstances here that are beyond our control, which, by the way, were created in large part by the government that were still looking to save us at some point. At a certain point, businesses cease to exist, and they cannot be easily rebuilt. And the pittance of compensation being offered to folks who are literally being, I'm waiting to see the bankruptcy rate. That to me is going to be the acid test in here at this state. How many businesses end up going bankrupt? And so then you have no economy, you have no one to pay the bills, you have no one to hire anyone. And we've skated by as a service economy dependent state now, and we're paying the price for that because of the onerous tax schedules, if you will, for small business, and the onerous fees, and the incompetent government, and the terrible execution of government appointed activities. So the problem is unless you're willing to write big checks, and I mean big. And in the case of the Club Max, and listen, after the show, I'll let him explain. I'm not going to speak on his behalf. But unless you're willing to write 6-figure, 7-figure checks to people by putting them out of business, at a certain point, you have to, it's their property. The state does not have a right to interfere in those relationships. And quite frankly, their interference so far has led to nothing but catastrophe. So I can't easily let these people just be, let off the cliff, because who's coming to help them? Who's going to pay their rent? There is no holiday, or there's no cavalry for the small business that's to support the state. So what do you say to them, Bill? I mean, where does the money come from? There is no money.
Well, the money comes from the same source of the $2.5 trillion that was minted earlier this year. We need to continue to print money. We need to continue to distribute it. And Lieutenant Governor McKee is sort of knocking on that door. I think truly that the way that this has been handled economically in terms of the distribution of funds has been extremely poor, if not embarrassing as well. But you've got to find a way to distribute adequate funding. I agree with that. I don't think businesses.
But then you're encouraging a spiral that's already starting to take place. The debt. The sheer volume of debt, and by the way, it's equal opportunity. I'm not going to point fingers at anybody because the blame is everywhere. The sheer level of debt in this country is not sustainable. We're reaching, if we haven't reached already by some measurements, that point where when debt consumes most of your GDP, debt payment, I should say, and debt servicing, then you've got a huge problem. There is finite growth to our economy, and while printing paper is already resulting in price increases. It's already artificially inflating the stock market. It's, we are creating bubbles that we've just run out of monetary and fiscal tricks to recover from.
That's true in a closed system, but I wouldn't call our system completely closed, right?
Do you want to be Greece? Do you want to be Venezuela? I don't say we're there yet, but you know what? We're knocking on those doors. When the currency starts, the dollar is suffering around the world. So we there's no blank checkbook anymore. Somebody has to create wealth. Somebody has to be productive somewhere. And when you put a fist right to the solar plexus of Rhode Island small business, nothing left.
Well, here's a couple of things I want to add to that. So first off, I wouldn't compare us to Venezuela at all. I mean, the way that we do business in America is far from being so closed off as Venezuela's economic system. So
now,
we're not the apples to oranges. I would also say that in this time, during this crisis, I don't know how anyone can really be productive. My concern when I look at states like California, where they're shutting down restaurants, and right across from the restaurants they're shutting down, they're allowing a picnic table to get spread out for a movie to be filmed and for people to eat next to that restaurant. Like, that's an issue, right? Because that it's unfair. And clearly there's not an emphasis on preventive measures for that film industry company as compared to the restaurant. So, I haven't heard of that story in Rhode Island yet. I hope that's not happening here. But in general, I would agree with Bill. I think, the issue with government in our country, as we know, has always been one of allocation. How are resources allocated, and are they done so in an equitable fashion? And we can certainly add an element to what equity is, right? We can add an element of understanding that businesses are risky, or business in general is risky. Why don't we account for that in the equitable distribution of these resources? In other words, we can't keep a business going. It needs to keep itself going. But after this crisis, can we stimulate it, right? And really, can we focus on micro entities, right? Not the small businesses that are making 10 million in revenue a year, because that at this point doesn't make sense at all. But I also want to I want to add those 2 points, and we can go back to that, Pat, if you want. But I also just want to say that, we're generally in a time where we have these businesses that are hard hit, but at the same time, they're not, the restaurants where clusters are breaking out are not going to be sued. You see what I'm saying? They're not liable. They're not going to be liable for people getting sick with COVID-19. So while there has been some harm done for an inappropriate response by state governments across the country, I also feel like businesses that have been open and not taking adequate measures have also been protected. We've seen that as well. I just want to add that we have to have a balanced discussion here about some businesses that continue to be open, don't take measures, don't enforce any measures, and at the same time, when people leave that restaurant, take COVID-19 to their houses and people get sick and die, nothing's going to be done either. So I'm just a little frustrated, because I'm all about the economy. I'm all about businesses doing well. I believe we live in a great nation. I mean, I don't like cronyism and nepotism. I'm all against that. But at the end of the day, we have businesses that are also not taking responsibility to protect their customers in a time where we have COVID-19 infecting 1 million people in 3 days. 1 million people in 3 days.
Well, let me ask you something, Doctor, if I could just jump in. What sacrifices have been made by the government sector?
You have to have a more pointed question.
Okay.
There, Pat.
Right now, the business sector, the dreaded private sector, as I call it, is being crucified, being impaled on the stake that is COVID-19. We have yet to see, incredibly enough, because you talk about being able to generate funds to solve problems, we have yet to see any significant cuts, any cuts whatsoever in terms of government employment, government salaries, programs. Again, I always point out the tens of millions of dollars that we spend to sponsor a General Assembly that is not even in business right now. You've got countless people being employed, highly compensated individuals with no accountability during normal times. What cuts has been taking place, whether it be in staffing, and I don't want to see them get laid off, but let's just say shared sacrifice. How about a 20% pay cut across the board in state employment for people making over $50,000 a year? I don't see it. I don't see anything. So the notion that a handful of businesses would taint the well, poison the well, who are acting irresponsibly, when in fact the question of them being open is not the same as the question of whether or not they are being irresponsible in spreading the disease. The gentleman in question, whose gym has fought to stay open, by all accounts, by every measurement, has invested a significant amount of money. And we'll talk about this in the next show. A significant amount of money, as well as a significant amount of resources, as well as the behavioral modifications necessary to operate the establishment as safely as possible. All the while, costing him a lot of money. And again, where's the sacrifice on government?
All right. So let's be honest about gyms here. We have people running on treadmills who are taking their mask off. It doesn't matter how many times you wipe a wall. Aerosolized particles are going to get into people's respiratory tract. You can give me any physical therapist you want that wants to debate that and bring them on the show, Pat. Happy to have that debate. At the end of the day, gyms should not have been open. Now, that does not mean that I do not believe that government should not have been supporting those businesses so that after the crisis, in one way or the other, whether it's in a grant form or some other type of specialized program, they would be kept from going bankrupt and actually being able to reestablish themselves. I do believe now that may not be what libertarians believe in terms of like government stimulus, but in this case and with that type of business, a micro entity here in the state of Rhode Island, I believe that we could support that business and we should. And so to your argument, which I'm with, that there's no shared sacrifice from state government. Yeah, that's been an issue, right? We know that. Again, it goes back to like, are we allocating resources responsibly? Without a doubt, the state of Rhode Island, I don't know if they've ever done that, but certainly not in the last decade. So, but if we're going to do something, and if this is about what we should be doing, even in the next 7 days, if we allocated $5 million to a food fund to ensure that of the potentially 1,000 on average cases that we get every single day between now and the 10th day, that we could provide 10 days worth of food to each of those households, that alone would have an extraordinary impact on the transmission rate in the state of Rhode Island. But that is a $5 million investment, much of which may not be all, like we may not spend it all. Not every household will need $500 worth of food, right? Unless there's like 7 people living in it. But at the end of the day, that's an investment that can have a quantifiable impact on the state of Rhode Island in 10 days. And that's the same approach that we should be having for businesses as well, right? Not every business needs the same stimulus amount. Not every business needs the same dollar amount, right? And generally, like, while I believe in equity, we have to talk about equity in the context of like, what type of industry are they in? Well, what are their operational costs? What are their profit margins? And we all know, right? We know that a 2% operational cost increase for a restaurant can actually lead a restaurant to be bankrupt. And that's what we're seeing, right? Because that 2% operational cost was the plexiglass that they put in over the last 6 months. So it's understandable why restaurants are going out of business or why they may go out of business. But we have the intelligence and the knowledge, like I've just shared there, to actually make an investment to help them come back. I don't know if libertarians agree with that, Pat, but I'm saying that we should help the businesses, but we should also acknowledge that in this crisis, at the end of the day, where we are now, there's no safe way to operate some of these businesses. No safe way.
But do we have, let me just play devil's advocate, do we in fact have any evidence whatsoever, in terms of not in terms of hypothetical, not in terms of biological, but, with the amount of, and again, government is a failure. And by the way, if government breaks something, government should figure out a way to pay for it. The challenge here, of course, is that government is us. So we are, in fact, going to pay for government's failures. And the failure here is obscene. But again, the question I've got is, since we're spending all this money on contact tracing, I'm curious as to how many cases can actually be attributed to spread at a gym that have actually happened. Not theoretical, not hypothetical, but that have actually happened. And should that not be part of the due diligence taking place in terms of investigating if these people object to being shut down? It's their property. People have the right to make consensual decisions to go there or to not go there, and to be open or not be open. Where does government have the moral authority to dictate to that people? They don't.
A couple of things. Well, moral authority is in saving lives, right? I mean, I took a Hippocratic oath. So at the end of the day, it's about do no harm. So for the most part, that's what I believe. And like, I want to get to the evidence part here, Pat, and Scott does have something to say. So I want to be respectful in giving Scott some space.
Absolutely.
But in terms of contact tracing, yes, where is the evidence? But the lack of evidence due to a failed contact tracing force operation here in the state of Rhode Island does not mean that there are not cases. And I just want to acknowledge here that we have been told that cases have not been transmitted within schools. And yet when I asked whether we had the operational unit that would be doing contact tracing internal to schools, that unit had not been built out yet. So the reason we don't have evidence of that is the information is not being collected because there's no one there to collect it. And that's the biggest issue. If businesses, to your point, Pat, took more responsibility early on and with a little support from government to understand what that responsibility should have been to do contact tracing more than just collecting numbers, then maybe we would have been in a different place. And I do think that that's shared responsibility. It would have been starting with the state, providing information and training, and then businesses taking that on. That would have been the ideal, but it didn't happen, Pat. But I just want to acknowledge that just because we don't have someone on the front line collecting the information does not mean that there is an absence of transmission, especially in high-risk environments like gyms. I just have to stress that. Scott?
Yeah, so I just had a couple of quick points. I just wanted to, to Pat's point and to your point when you said, that the government can support businesses that are, that are shut down during an extended pause. There just reaches a point where there's just no more money to be had or no more money to be taxed. And I mean, you can print the money, but it eventually leads to inflation in the long term. In the short term, maybe not. Maybe that's determined to be seen. So that's just something to be thought about. And as we've talked about providing families with, you said like $500 or so worth of food, I do think that's a very noble idea. Here's where I think it falls down. Keep people home for a week or for 2 weeks. We can provide them with the food. However, to enforce people staying at home or a lockdown order, neither Rhode Island nor really I think any state in the union has enough officers either at the local level or at the state level to basically keep everybody indoors. If people want to go outside, they're going to go outside, and I think that's the struggle here. So I think it's less about about the vouchers and more about changing the mindset to get these COVID deniers to just finally see sense and see that this is a real thing and that people younger than all of us on this panel right now are dying from it, so that you don't need to enforce this by having state police and local police basically monitor everybody. It's just kind of my thought for the day.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it, Scott. And just to say, I mean, giving people food mitigates, right, the risk. I mean, it reduces the likelihood that they would leave for food, and we all know people have to eat, right, on a daily basis. So, but yeah, for someone who's just generally not interested in following any directions or taking, or if they don't care about their neighbors, then they're going to do what they want to do. In terms of businesses, though, and like at some point there's no money. Let's talk about what we could do, though. What could we do? Well, if a business is going to plead bankruptcy anyway, if they're going to go through like asset forfeiture and just like all of that, and it's going to take time and very little is going to come back to the municipality, why not just pretty much give everyone a year without having to pay tangible property tax? I mean, if the business is going to go out of business anyway, right? The loss is a loss. That's a form of investment from my perspective. You're helping them keep money in their pockets. And we could do that. We could do that throughout multiple municipalities in Providence, Pawtucket, Central Falls, right? Especially those that have been most impacted by COVID-19.
But that's a fabulous. And first, one of the things I was going to suggest is a sales tax holiday to actually stimulate purchases. But the challenge there, and I think it's an excellent idea. But the challenge, of course, is that what should have happened, amongst other things that should have happened over the last 8 or 9 months, is that government should have been really tightening the waistband. I mean, just shredding costs. And again, no one is saying that government employees should be laid off en masse. Well, maybe in a different time, maybe we'll have that conversation. But ultimately, are you telling me that everyone making over $60,000, say, for example, just an arbitrary number, an arbitrary and capricious number, as I would like to say to the governor, shouldn't take a 20% pay cut? You're telling me?
Yeah, somebody.
Go ahead, buddy.
No. Somebody asked me the other day what I would do about this situation, and look, I agree with you, Pat. One of the first things I said was suspension of taxation for these businesses, whether it's 2 quarters or a full year. Another thing, and I just looked at my notes right here. This number 3, abolish the Bridge and Turnpike Authority immediately. You know what I mean? So there are ways that government should take big hits as well. And I'm not saying that you look at our space program, our military industrial operations. There are places to poach funds from for the survival of, not the survival of the species, that's a bit exaggerated, but for triaging this moment. So I just want to be clear that it's not that I want to see the businesses go out of business. If I were single-handedly in charge, I would take funds from things that I believe are disposable or could be reduced and apply them to businesses that right now, like gyms, that are, in my opinion, I think, and look just from medical research, a potential risk at minimum. And so I just want to clarify my position on that it's not that I think we should endlessly print money, although I think we can print quite a bit of money before we get ourselves into severe inflation at this point.
And just as an example, let me throw this thing in. I know I apologize for taking so much pipeline up here tonight, but it's the Rhode Island charges a minimum tax of $400 to companies. Now, obviously, CVS isn't going to have a problem with that. But if you were to waive the minimum tax, and for this year, as well as the filing fees to maintain your corporate status, that alone would put $500 in. Now, that's nowhere near what it takes to keep, a capital-intensive business, whether it be retail like the gym we're talking about or the manufacturing businesses. But again, there needs to be cuts now, and the governor and you folks are there. Bill, you're there. You hear her when I say that. You hear her say, "Oh, there's going to be cuts next year." Well, what are we waiting for? We need the money now. And to the doctor's point, I believe it can be the role of government to provide humanitarian aid, particularly since they're the ones who broke it. So they got to fix it. So take that money that you're spending on high dollar salaries to state employees, and I'm talking about, the $100 and $130 and $150,000 salaries, and let's slice and dice for this year. They'll survive. And I'm just being a socialist like everybody else in the damn state, right, Scott? Why not? Everybody is. Everybody's willing to. Let's give it away. So I see nothing coming from what I call the true 1% in this state are state employees, highly compensated state employees. They are the true 1%ers in this state. The state's driven out most big business. So I don't know, call me a cynic. I cede my time for the rest of the show since I've taken up so much time. I apologize.
No, gents. So, it's been a spirited show. As always, Pat lit the match with the feud. And there we go. But in general, I think we've all come to, just to finish the arch here, is the arc is, that we can do things, right? We can do some things. Being reactive is probably not the best strategy. So in being proactive, some of the things that we should consider doing are, how can we put dollars back into small businesses' pockets, especially those that are suffering during this time. And how can we really communicate that we're going to do that in a way where those businesses and those business owners do not have to panic and worry through the holidays as to what's going to happen for the remainder of their business's life and their lives. And some of the things can be reducing certain specific taxes, tax holidays around annual property tax, maybe year long, right? Like give people a year's worth back. But the key is, I think that in doing that, these are still people, these are still humans, and we all need to make it through this pandemic. So in terms of the immediate future, I just want to throw it out there that I continue to think that food should be a focus. And in addition to food, shelter, and second to that, safety. So food, shelter, safety should be on our minds for the next 10 days, and making sure that everyone in the state of Rhode Island has those three things. And we can do our part. I know that we're all doing our part already in different ways, but if someone needs help, maybe what we can do next week, Pat, is maybe we can create a post with all the phone numbers and, getting people the information that they need, and just having a post that we can reshare. I think that'll be helpful, especially with the holidays coming up and this dark winter, being really at the beginning phase of it. So with that, I'm going to,
I just wanted to point out that as of this week, and I'm putting up some back shows, you can see replays of this show in a variety of places around Facebook. But if you want an easy way to just go back on a calendar basis for each of the Pump Up the Volume shows, they are on the homepage now with a big, beautiful picture of our host, the man, all right, Dr. Munoz, you can actually scroll down now through shows, and there'll be show information that'll be able to be posted there as well. Upcoming guests and things like that. So go to coalitionradionetwork.com, and we're going to be in the new year we're going to be working on with some technology to broaden the spread so that we can access more of Dr. Munoz's if you will, the halo that surrounds him in terms of social media and the web. We're going to be working on that. But that will be that type of stuff. It will be up there right on the homepage at coalitionradionetwork.com.
Awesome. Thanks, Pat. Thanks for all the work that you're doing on this, Pat, as well. It's a great medium. And so with that, we have about 5 minutes before we're going to be rushed off because the Coalition Radio Network has another show coming up. So what I want to do is I want to give everyone those 60 seconds. Please elevate, push anything that's coming up on your end so that the viewers can know where to find you. And then also any finishing statement that you might have. Why don't we'll start with Pat, then Scott, then Bill.
I'll be very, very brief. After the show tonight, you'll have an opportunity to get sort of a counterpoint. Mr. D'Amico, one of the proprietors of said gym, is going to be on, and we're going to talk a little bit about his business. And Tuesday nights going forward, after Pump Up the Volume, every week there will be something called the Coalition of Business Focus, where we bring business people on to promote, not just talk about COVID-19, but actually to talk about their business and promote them. Please, folks, whether you go to the Facebook page, the Rhode Island Holiday Challenge, whether you go to there's another group setting up to do sort of mob-type purchases on local businesses. Please, through the rest of this year, if you have the resources to do so, if you've got disposable income or you're spending money on necessities, please support local businesses. At this point in time, the one thing all of us, I think, in this showroom can agree is that we need to look to each other. We need to stop depending on other people or waiting for other people. There's a lot of work that Rhode Islanders can do to support each other in these difficult times. Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Pat. Scott?
All right, everybody. You can catch me every Monday night on 990wbob.com on the Rotunda from 8 to 9 p.m. I tend to shoot from the lip and get people from the left and the right a little bit agitated. Here's what I'm going to ask. Just everybody, just please out there, everyone who's listening to this, just be mindful. Wear the mask. It's not just protecting yourself; it's protecting people who might get this awful disease. And if we can all just stick it out for a little bit longer, we will get through this. I know I said I don't quite see the light at the end of the tunnel just yet, but if we can stick together and use that stick-to-itiveness that ironically we had as a nation right after Pearl Harbor, and just get together and beat this thing, we'll be able to see it through. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Awesome. Bill?
Very quickly, a frequent commentator of mine that's watching the show tonight writes and says, why didn't we get N95 masks for everybody who's in the most vulnerable category way back in the spring? We would have been able to stave off a lot of this spread at minimum. So I'll put that out there. Maybe that's something we can discuss next week on the show. You can always find me at ripodcast.com. We've got a big episode coming up on Friday, our year-end review roundtable discussion with some familiar voices. Every Tuesday and Friday, new episodes there. Wednesday night, Rhode Island PBS, 7 o'clock, Rhode Island PBS Weekly. And then this week on Thursday and Friday, 9 a.m. to noon on WPRO. I'll meet you there. And always here on Tuesday nights as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Bill. And great first show, by the way, on PBS. It was really
Appreciate
good.
it.
Yeah. So with that, I just want to thank everyone. I want to end on a principle or a word that emphasizes a principle and a value that I recently learned, and it's one that Paul Farmer talks about. It's this principle of accompaniment. And so I'm going to use Paul Farmer's words. I'm going to quote what he says here, but I think it's an important time in history to acknowledge that people are stressed, people are afraid, not only for their health in some cases, but also for their businesses and their livelihood. And doing our part as community members, as well as state officials, and this message goes out to the governor and everyone in state government, it is important that our actions in one way, shape, or form make people feel like they're being accompanied. And so Paul Farmer says, to accompany someone is to go somewhere with him or her, to break bread together, to be present on a journey with a beginning and an end. There's an element of mystery and openness. I'll share your fate for a while, and by a while I don't mean a little while. Accompaniment is much more often about sticking with a task until that task is deemed completed by the person or persons being accompanied. All right, so with that, I think what we can take and what we should take is sometimes people just want to walk with you and want you to walk with them. So why don't we all do our part in the next week and take the first step in helping our communities and in protecting our families. Thanks, everyone. Join us next week, Tuesday evening on Pump Up the Volume.